Welcome to the Canna Conversations blogcast, part video blog, part podcast, aimed to bridge the gap between the cannabis industry and the patients it serves. Join the ladies of Midwest Canna Concierge as they bring everyone to the table, from cultivation experts and dispensary staff to lawyers, doctors, and medical marijuana patients, to have open conversations around all things cannabis related.
Hello, everyone. We are back. We are here today with Nicco Reggente from Strain Genie. Nicco, it's so good to have you here. I'm so excited. I just did my Strain Genie report just a couple weeks ago, and that's how we got connected. So I'm really interested to hear kind of how you got started in it and how it even developed.
Yeah, sure. Cool. Thanks for trying it out. It's always encouraging to see when people want to learn more about themselves and cannabis in general, and just really push forward the impetus of education. So it's really cool to hear. Thank you for signing up.
Absolutely.
Let's see where to start with Strain Genie. So for a long time, I've been passionate about the notion of personalized medicine, precision medicine, P4 medicine, whatever name you want to call it, but basically just taking into account the individual differences that exist across people when prescribing some form of treatment, therapy, and in this case, cannabis. It kind of goes back to, the father of medicine, Hippocrates, said that it's more important to understand the person that a disease has than to understand the disease that a person has. So I've kind of internalized that for a long time. And during my graduate work, when I was doing my PhD at UCLA, I got really into using neural data and machine learning to predict outcome likelihoods of people that are going into, this is, for instance, people with OCD going into cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a very, long, lengthy, intensive, and expensive process. So if we were able to be able to gather some insights as to the chemical makeup of that person, or the way that, in this case, we were using neuroimaging, so we're using fMRI. If we're able to predict whether or not that person's going to have a solid outcome from that therapy, then ahead of time, then we can save them the time, money, and energy and direct them into different different treatment programs. So around the time that I was doing that, I also was watching my wife, who has pretty intense stage 4 endometriosis, and she was trying to find relief from cannabis as the same time that my mom, who had breast cancer at the time, was trying to find relief as well. And as like a typical new user into the market, it's almost analysis paralysis, right? When trying to determine what it is that would be good for you, right? When I'm going into the dispensary, am I, just picking up the brownie on the counter and calling it a day, or is there something more, specific that we can do? And a lot of people get lost in that process, admittedly.
Crippled by the overwhelm.
Exactly. Yeah. Crippled by the overwhelm. I call it analysis paralysis. But same concept. So I kind of saw those two things and I was like, oh, well, we could use something like machine learning in the same way that I'm doing it in neuroscience, apply it to cannabis. So that was kind of what got the gears turning. And I had originally developed a separate suite of technology that basically functioned more like an Amazon or Netflix, where you're trying different products, you're rating them, and then we're able to kind of collaboratively filter, like from the crowd, to recommend you new products that you haven't tried before, that's helping other people that are similar to you, type of situation. So the same way that Netflix kind of recommends you different shows, we were recommending you different cannabis products. And in that process, we kind of came across what's a common problem in all machine learning, really, is what's known as the cold start problem. If I don't know anything about you, and you haven't tried, a sufficiently large number of products, how can we actually make a meaningful recommendation? And that's where it kind of clicked that, oh, well, we could use these static insights about your genome, your genetics and your DNA to try and make at least some meaningful recommendation for you without knowing anything about what you've tried before or what you've done in the past. So Strain Genie was kind of birthed out of us trying to get over that cold start problem and then start incorporating it into that feedback loop, et cetera, that we had. So yeah, that's kind of the skinny on how it came to be, if you will.
I love that. And I want to add that you're out in California. We're here in Ohio, so it's very different. You guys have a much more developed and available market out there to work in. So how has that helped you kind of market this tool?
Yeah, I guess from a couple angles. One is that by having a more diverse product inventory library available throughout, Southern California, it's kind of the mecca in the US right now in terms of product diversity. We're able to provide more precise recommendations for people. And on the other side, right, it was actually the market kind of creates itself, right? I had run a peer-reviewed study, which I can maybe link to you at some point, that showed across dispensary visitors, so patients throughout Southern California, 85% of them self-reported in our survey that they were looking for some type of meaningful, or that they were looking for some type of personalized recommendation when they're going into the store. Like they need something specifically for sleep, or something to make them more active, or something to ameliorate their, muscle pain, et cetera. And on the flip side of that, right, 85% of bud tenders told us that they lack any bit of meaningful recommendation or meaningful information to provide such a recommendation, right? So that kind of gap right there, which is, made even more pronounced by the diversity of the product offering, kind of really helped us kind of get our footing and say like, oh, well, here's our market fit, right? It's this huge gap that's not being answered. So yeah, it's kind of both sides. It both helped create us, but then it's also allowing for us to pinpoint with extra specificity for specific products for people.
That's awesome. Even not being able to have access to the products, I noticed on my report, like you guys give what kind, top terpenes, the best ratio to help you medicate yourself and treat certain things that you might be at a higher risk for. So can you kind of give an idea of what type of information people can get from their report?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the first part of what you're saying of like recommending specific terpenes or cannabinoids, essentially on the back end of Strain Genie, what's really happening is that we're creating this ideal personalized cocktail of cannabinoids and terpenes for you, right? So, and usually those types of, that product doesn't exist. It would need to be tailor-made for you. So what we're doing is essentially taking that information and then finding products that have the maximal similarity to that cocktail, to kind of connect you to the right products. But taking a further step back, the types of things that you can learn in your Strain Genie report vary from insights into your endocannabinoid system, right? So learning about the bioavailability of THC and CBD, depending on which form factor you choose. Maybe we can get into a little bit more detail in that later. And then also showing your genetic predispositions to a number of different disorders and diseases, and showing and connecting it to other peer-reviewed research that shows, okay, well, this particular cannabinoid or this particular terpene has been shown to ameliorate some of the symptoms associated with those particular diseases or disorders, or even help to actually combat the onset of them in the first place. So basically the report is this long, big section categorized summary of just different insights into your health and how cannabis can be a bridge to assisting you on the journey towards, well-being and health, taking into account all of the information that's provided from your genetic predispositions.
I'd love to kind of, oh, go ahead, keep going.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sure we're gonna get there anyway.
I just really want to dive into that a little bit deeper, because I think that there's a lot of value, even with experienced users. People kind of learn over time what works for them, or how, say, edibles, hit them, or that edibles don't work for them, or different types of things. So how does going through this process and the readout that your product gives people, how does that help people understand the most effective ways to medicate? Or do you isolate specifically? I know you isolate the conditions that they may have or may be at risk for, but how about symptoms? Do you ask people what symptoms they're trying to treat, or?
Yeah, so twofold. We do also ask, when you sign up, there's a medical onboarding questionnaire that tries to get at okay, what are you trying to actually personally solve? And then we can use that information to then match you to products that are helping other people that have a maximal similarity to you. But to go back to the first part of your question is, so for instance, it's probably best to give an example, right? So the edible example is perfect, right? So when you take an edible, it's going through first pass metabolism, which means it's going through your liver, getting broken down and put into your bloodstream. For certain people, right, there's actually a very well studied enzyme, or a set of enzymes, the cytochrome P450 family of enzymes that break down THC and CBD, as well as a host of other medications. And basically, there's specific genetic markers that show your enzymatic velocity for that particular enzyme. And that's just a way of saying how good is that particular enzyme at breaking down THC, or the analog one for CBD, right? So for certain people, right, they may be an ultra slow metabolizer of THC. What's going to happen in that case, right? In that case, when you ingest THC, it's going to stay in your system at a much higher magnitude and for much longer periods of time. So that's why for some people, right, especially if you're that slow metabolizer, if you take an edible, it's end of the day for you, and then you're maybe experiencing lethargy for up to 72 hours in the future.
I like to call that my edible hangover.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
which now, now that I know that I have, I have a slight risk for a slow THC metabolism.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And so this is a perfect example. There are times, depending on how late in the day, it's not that I'm down and out, because I know milligram wise how to not get myself down and out. But I have had on several occasions, if I take it later in the day, then I still feel it in the morning.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That would make sense.
Yeah. So that's kind of, and, in those cases, right, it can be particularly important. And, maybe Kelsey can even speak to this, is that, from that same family of enzymes, those are ones that are responsible for breaking down other medications as well. So the longer that the THC or CBD is in your system and potentially occupying that wheelhouse, that set of enzymes, that could make it less likely for them to break down your medications in time, right? So it kind of starts getting pretty important. And then on the flip side, right, you could also be an ultra fast metabolizer, right? In which case, you can take a ton of THC edibles and it's not really moving the needle for you, if you will. And same thing with CBD. So in those cases, right, you can either up dosage, which is expensive and potentially taxing, or you can choose, a different ingestion method that bypasses first pass metabolism, such as inhalation, or depending on what you need, even topical as well, or sublingual.
Or all of the above.
Yeah.
That's another question I had, is how do you configure, and you sort of answered it with the metabolizing, but how do you configure the different forms or methods of consumption for individuals based on, I know that for myself, it section, I don't have it handy with me, but it sectioned off the percentages of the different consumption methods. How do you figure that out? How can you get that from our DNA?
Yeah, so it's essentially our style of doing it, which is that we're aggregating all these different insights. So for instance, if you're a slow metabolizer, right, we're going to super downweight edibles for you, right? And we're going to upweight inhalation, or we're going to upweight sublingual. But then if you have a predisposition to lung cancer, we're going to downweight inhalation methods, right? But then if you also have a number of different predispositions to, let's say, psoriasis or eczema, then we might upweight topicals, right? So it's hard in a lot of ways to distill all of the information. So, sometimes we're like, hey, if you had to look at a glance, like maybe you should focus on this particular form factor over others, right? If we had to boil it down and distill it into a single thing. But yeah, it's essentially just a multivariate like combination of different things that go into that weighting, if you will, for that distribution.
That makes sense. But I think that's awesome because then people can kind of pick and choose how heavy to lean on one method versus the others, and how to incorporate all of them into their routine.
Yeah. We also try and do something similar to that with our activity groups, which essentially is combining disparate areas of research and saying, let's use an example of like having a predisposition to a neurodegenerative disorder. In those cases, there's specific cannabinoids and terpenes that can help, but then there's also lifestyle changes that you can make as well. So in those cases, we might recommend for neurodegenerative disorders an uptick in strains and products that fall into our energize activity group, because that might get you more mobile and active, which can then increase BDNF in your brain, which then helps to mitigate the potential onset of neurodegenerative disorder. So we have a suite of different things kind of like that as well, that is more like at a glance type information that complement, cannabis, as amazing as it is not a panacea, right? So it needs to be complemented by different lifestyle changes, and just having that information helps to equip the individual with a little bit more guidance.
I think that's just awesome. I think it's fantastic because, as much as we'd like to, we can't look at cannabis in a vacuum. We can't, we can't expect to look at it as just one thing that a person does or that a person is. We have to look at the entire person, and we have to recognize that there are other non-medical treatments that will oftentimes benefit the patient a lot more. So yeah, that's something that I love that you guys incorporate into your product and offer a patient the opportunity to grow and take control of their own fate in a way. And something that I think, healthcare providers need to embrace in a sense of, creating this situation where we're looking not only at the medications that we can prescribe for the patient, but also the non-pharmaceutical, treatments we can recommend, and the non-medicinal, more physical or emotional based treatments that we can offer for somebody, so that they have an opportunity to improve themselves in multiple different ways. And that's going to improve their opportunities to actually get better, or prevention, or whatever somebody's goals might be. But I think that's awesome. That's fantastic. Kind of growing or building off of that a little bit. How do you incorporate, because this field is constantly evolving. So what sort of, take do you guys have on how to keep up with the constantly evolving research and where things go as we progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, just to your former point, like I completely agree. I mean, it's a certain philosophy that hopefully can become more rampantly adopted. I mean, it's this interesting divide between like Eastern philosophy of medicine and Western philosophy, which Western seems to be a little bit more of like just a shotgun approach of like, take this pill, it's like, whereas, and like more holistic methods that are concentrating on, promoting homeostasis within your body, kind of gets pushed aside as more wishy-washy. It's like, wait, hold on, like all we're talking about like is holistic, like taking everything into consideration, right? Like I think people kind of mix it up with like holistic and homeopathic, and like it's a shame that the H words got lumped together, but I digress. Yeah, as for, our team is a group of researchers, all from disparate fields, to be honest, two neuroscientists and a physicist. But we all have like a passion for research and genetics as well. But we keep a pulse on the proceedings and contributions to the scientific corpus of knowledge. And we essentially just update our system at regular intervals. And we do that in a way that, is kind of our IP, if you will, but it essentially takes into account everything from the impact factor of the journal that the proceedings were published in, how many citations it's accruing, whether or not it was on non-human primates, whether it was on humans, whether it was on rodents, the effect sizes of the statistics that were in there. So that kind of all gets crunched into our system, and it's just kind of like a rolling update. So that's the maintenance that we kind of put in to, keep everything kind of, as you said it right, it's a completely emerging field that's entirely in its infancy, right? So we need to be able to keep pace with that to be able to provide the type of meaningful information that we want to. But yeah, it's a great question.
I agree. I have a question that kind of just popped up as you were explaining that. Have you found that, I know that with it being fully legal out in California, I don't know what the medical market is like for you guys out there, but have you found that a number of doctor groups or doctors coming to you or making recommendations for patients to get this report done for themselves?
Yeah, that's honestly where we've gotten a large majority of our business. Is because for a lot of doctors, and it's at least this way in California, or it has been for a while, you can get a medical marijuana recommendation from a doctor, but then that doctor can't tell you which products to go seek out or which dispensary to go to. So our service is kind of like the perfect next step for them. It's like, hey, I can't tell you anything, but I could direct you to this information-based service that then could potentially help you out with that. So yeah, a large amount of our early business especially came from those types of avenues of like, okay, it's a newly minted medical marijuana patient, and we get the recommendation from the doctor. And actually our kits are in, at least a couple dozen doctor's offices around the country right now.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Would you say, and this, I don't know if you'll have these numbers offhand, but would you say that your demographic fits within a certain age group, or do you think it's pretty wide ranged?
Yeah, so it's actually a very curious question. So thus far, I've noticed, I haven't run the actual stats on it, but we've kind of regularly seen it, is that it skews female and it skews older. So, there are a lot of when I say older, I mean 50 and up, or 55 and up. And which is interesting because I kind of looked into it a little bit before when we were doing some fundraising, and that demographic is one of the most canna curious demographics, and they have more time, and they're spending a lot of time online, and they have disposable income, which is kind of like this very interesting perfect storm for them to find something like us.
And they want to know. They don't want to do the guessing game.
Yeah.
Women spend so much time sampling products that may or may not work for them and trying this or trying that. So I can totally see where they would be of the mindset of like, oh, this would be let's just streamline the process. You guys can tell me exactly what to look for. So I think that's awesome. Good to know.
I also love that you guys have the ability to pull the DNA info from Ancestry and other places. Like when I saw that, I was like, that's just brilliant. So many people, have already done that, or 23andMe, or, just because of curiosity type of situations. And I was like, I guess our DNA doesn't really change, does it?
Exactly.
It's always
static,
the same from 0 to however long we last. So I think that's great. I mean, how did you guys kind of come up with that integration? Is it something that was always intuitive, or?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because that's actually what came before we even started our test kits. So when we were starting this up, we were like, oh man, like this is intense. Like we got to make these, test kits in these boxes. We got to figure out all the logistics of like mailing it out, putting return labels, registration, and portals, and all of this like complicated stuff. And my wife, who's also a co-founder, was just like, why don't we just get them to download their raw 23andMe data and we process it? And I was just like, yep. It was perfect. It was like, it was one of those things where it's just like hanging right there, and then it just kind of clicked. So yeah, to be honest, I mean, 95% of our business comes from 23andMe or Ancestry, which is,
It's
yeah,
literally the only reason I had my report run.
yeah, I mean, to be honest, like even to listeners, I would recommend going that route. So getting the 23andMe, because, you know, for how they change their prices all the time, but for, let's say, $120, you're getting everything from 23andMe and a Strain Genie report, as opposed to, you know, having to pay for our more expensive process because our lab needs to extract your DNA, and then you don't get the 23andMe as well on top of it. So I always recommend, like, you know, go through the route that gives you more information. But we provide it as, you know, we provide our own test kits because some people have problems with 23andMe, et cetera, but it's all good.
They don't want to be on a list or on a registry.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all right.
Which is a
I get
whole
that.
another topic, yeah, because
Yeah. Well, can we,
23,
okay,
yeah.
so can we kind of touch, this is somewhat of a segue, but can we touch on like how, I know you guys look at mental health conditions or dependency factors. Can you kind of explain a little bit more, like the alcohol dependency and the opioid dependency and even cannabis dependency, if people are at risk for that, and why that would be beneficial to know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot, as with any consumption of mind-altering substance, it's important to have, you know, understanding of yourself. You know, some people can be like, oh, I have an addictive personality. And then even just that mindfulness and awareness of the situation can help to identify when, you know, certain, let's say, addiction type cravings are hitting. It makes it easier to identify when you develop a specific mindset like that. Especially, I mean, opioid dependence is almost difficult for anyone to overcome. So, you know, knowing that, and it's like, oh, I need to make a decision. Like, do I up my cannabis dosage or do I try out opioids? Well, if you're, you know, particularly more likely to develop an opioid addiction, maybe you choose cannabis over that instead, even if potentially it's not as effective in the beginning for you. But, you know, to that main spectrum of thought is a couple parts of the report that I find really important, or probably one of the more important parts that I actually think should be required for some people to take as they're getting a medical marijuana recommendation, is that there is actually a pretty potent genetic marker for identifying individuals who are at high risk for a cannabis-induced psychosis, which, you know, again, cannabis is not a panacea. It can, for certain individuals, especially with these arguably irresponsibly high THC levels in some of these products now, can cause a psychotic break in individuals, especially, you know, people that are in that sweet spot of like mid to late 20s, with, you know, have potentially had, you know, a schizophrenic episode or not. The right amount of cannabis for those people can totally change the rest of their lives, right? So if you're a doctor providing a recommendation for medical marijuana to an individual and they have that predisposition, right, it almost feels like this double-edged, or not even a double-edged sword. It's just like you're handing them this, I don't know, like a Trojan horse or something type thing, where it's, you know, doing way more harm than good for that person. So that's another aspect that I think is super important, especially for new users, and especially in this market that has, in a lot of ways, just it's kind of incorporated capitalism too much, in a way of just like, oh, let's maximize THC because that's the psychoactive thing. And it's like, okay, well, like, do you really think you know better than nature and the 113 different cannabinoids that are present, and how much more potent the entourage effect is in, you know, and this is even like R1 research, like in causing apoptosis or cell death in cancer cells. Like it's way more effective from the entourage perspective. But, you know, if you follow capitalism, it's like, oh, we need to enhance THC and lower price, right? So that's why, you know, certain strains are super popular. It's it's a shame in my opinion. But anyway, in that, I digress on that. Especially given that particular kind of market, it's particularly important for people that have that genetic predisposition to stay away from those super high THC products. Like those are the types of people that should be like 20 CBD to 1 THC, right? If you're going to even incorporate.
I
THC.
find that super interesting that there's a genetic marker for that, because my question was going to be how much is family history, personal history of, you know, that would increase risk, you know, in your risk-based assessment, and how much of it is you know, actually based on the genetics. So that's really, really interesting to know. I also have a question regarding tolerance. So oftentimes, you know, with patients that have, or people, anybody that has a history of, you know, a substance use disorder, whether it be opiate addiction or alcoholism or something like that, you know, they may want to turn to cannabis to help them abstain from those things in their recovery. But, you know, just anecdotally, we sometimes notice that they require higher levels of THC to, you know, get effectiveness. And, you know, it's the same with patients that, you know, have to have surgery, that have a history of addiction, of opioid addiction. You know, they're going to require higher doses for anesthesia purposes. But to see that translated into cannabis is kind of interesting because they're differing systems. And I've always wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more. Have you guys found anything in your analysis that kind of bears that out?
Not specifically outside of, you know, the metabolism aspect that we were talking about before. There's also, of course, the psychological phenomenon as well, right? Where, you know, if you're used to a very all-encompassing, let's say, psychedelic experience, right, that's completely taking over your psyche and putting you in a totally different realm, and then you try cannabis and it's just like, oh, you're taking a couple of puffs off of a joint, like, you know, like you're psychologically conditioned to feel almost like that's not moving the needle, if you will. But aside from that, and that's purely speculative, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there could be translations from, you know, people that have a tolerance to an opioid and then to cannabis by, you know, looking at downstream impacts of phytocannabinoids binding to your endocannabinoid system and causing different D2 receptor or dopamine receptor.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I really feel like it has to be related somehow to the neurotransmitters and the receptor, you know, based tolerance. That's
exactly. Yes.
That's always been my personal theory.
I would speculate that as well, because there are I mean, that's why, you know, for some people, there's cannabis related working memory loss in prefrontal cortices, and that can be due to specific people's like endogenous like dopaminergic receptor levels there. And then so there is this interaction between the endocannabinoid system and the D2 system or dopamine system and serotonin. So it's super complex, but there's enough connections there that overlap between even opioids and cannabis that, yeah, there can be cross tolerance for sure. But I'm definitely not, I'm not as well versed on the legit connection, but there's a connection.
Thanks for following that trail with me, though.
For sure. No, yeah. I'm gonna mark it to look up myself, because now I'm super more curious to find the connection.
Definitely.
Yeah, you guys really go into detail on the mood and personality section. Like I was just re-looking over the list, like anger and aggression, stress, neuroticism. I do have a question. What does lower empathy mean? Like what is that measurement? Like how do you measure somebody having empathy? in your DNA? I didn't know that was in my DNA.
So again, it's more of a predisposition, right? Or the likelihood of developing lower empathy. But there's a number of different genetic conditions that lead to lower empathy, right? Like autism, et cetera. Any type of neurodivergent behavior can oftentimes be coupled with a lack of capacity to internalize the states of others. And that could be, the range is wild. It could be the inability to escape one's own ego and perspective take, or it could be the inability to pick up social or facial micro mimicry type or facial muscle cues. So it can range from a number of different things. And I think that our particular example, or what we're particularly looking at is like a combination of all of those. So yeah, and in those cases, right, like more social promoting cannabinoids and terpenes may be more particularly beneficial for those individuals. Yeah.
I think that also ties into what we were talking about with, the side effects and the fact that cannabis, we need to be aware of, particularly with THC, the, negative effects that it can have if it's not dosed appropriately, and utilizing, products and preparations that utilize the entourage effect, as much as we can, and maybe diving into those minor cannabinoids a little bit more than we would otherwise if we are more prone to these, negative types of effects. I would say that, how would you approach somebody, that says, oh, weed is weed, and what sort of answer would you have for that in light of your product and what it could show them?
Yeah. Oh, how could I say that? I mean, to me, that would be equivalent to saying food is food, right? Like last time I checked, like food can have this diverse realm of different sensations and textures and flavors. And, there's only kind of 5 different types of flavors, but they combine in all these unique ways to have this rich palette of different things. And it's like, I mean, if food is food, then weed is weed. And if you're willing to make that claim, then we're probably not going to keep talking anymore, so.
That's so funny. I was just like, I would just end the conversation like, well, that's your ignorance, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, it's crazy how much of a difference it can make. I mean, you can see, right? I mean, everybody's kind of been in that smoke circle, passing around the same joint and seeing everybody react differently. And then a different reaction from everyone from a different set, right? So that's a testament to both the impact of, a specific cannabinoid terpene cocktail and the individual differences within a person. So it goes both ways. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a ton of people that are saying like, oh, don't overcomplicate weed, man. Like, and it's like, I get you, but at the same time, like, there's a whole swath of the population that needs this type of specificity, right? Like if you're just getting high and you're just smoking weed to get high, maybe you want to avoid some weed that makes you more tired or something, or you want some that makes you more tired, and it doesn't really get any more complicated than that, right? For that person. But for people that are, 85% of people that are looking for some form of personalized recommendation or specific desired outcome, it makes the world of a difference. Yeah.
I think that's a key way to say it. People that are looking for a specific outcome, the ones that are not just like, oh, let's see what this one does. Let's see how high I can get today. The people that are looking to alleviate specific ailments, to get a certain type of mood or effect to allow them to live their day and improve their quality of life. I think that these reports can change the game.
Agreed. I hope so.
I have a question we talked about, or you mentioned it briefly earlier, but we talked about the smoking warning, and it's like somebody has a higher risk for lung cancer. I mentioned in my email, in Ohio, smoking is illegal. So although dry herb is sold, it's sold with the impression that they will dry herb vaporize it at home.
Wow.
And yes,
yeah.
So obviously there's no way to generally enforce that. People are going to do what they're going to do. But for the people that follow the rules, would that type of like the inhalation warning, I think at the bottom, because I had a higher risk or an increased risk for lung disease or lung cancer on my report, and it had said at the end of the report, the product recommendations would still show inhalation products, but like recommended not doing that. Is that inhalation warning more so for something that's going to be combusted, or would that also apply to any type of vaporization?
Yeah, so it's more so geared towards the combustion of plant material. With vaping, it's significantly less carcinogenic and tar producing. So that one's still okay. The jury seems to be a little bit out on, distillates and, anything that's, more prepackaged or pod based. And like the traditional 510 cartridges, et cetera, mainly because of the extra things that are added into there. Propylene glycol seems to be safe, but it's, people kind of go back and forth on it as like a mixture. And then there's other contaminants of, depending on what the extraction was. So it kind of varies back and forth, but I would say that Ohio's maybe being pretty prudent on that aspect of saying stick to like the dry herb vaporizer. But yeah, so to answer your question, it would be more so to avoid the combustion of plant material itself. Yeah.
That makes sense. Good to know.
Looking to the future, like what would you love to see, as far as your product and its incorporation into, medicine in general, where you would like to, like, what's your pie in the sky future dream?
Yeah. Well, some of the immediate goals that we have in action are we're really trying to create a women's health focused panel that can help with menstrual pain and a ton of different things that are more specific to women. So that's kind of like one of the first things that we're definitely expanding on. But the next main part is to really try and connect the information to a more actionable outcome, right? So, for instance, Danielle, in your Strain Genie report, you probably see a bunch of products in there that you can't necessarily get, right? So that's something we're aware of. And it's something that we're now starting to partner with dispensaries to create like an in-store kiosk and be able to get all of their inventory and say, okay, now I have my Strain Genie card. I'm going into this dispensary, highlight for me everything that's available in this dispensary that matches my outcome. So that's step one, is to kind of make that more approachable for people. Step two is that we're partnering with some very cool hardware companies that can integrate with our system that essentially can deliver an approximate of that personalized cocktail I was talking about at the beginning. So, if you're familiar with just a traditional vape, or do you remember those pens where you can like push down and it's a different color depending on where you push, right?
Yeah.
So we have
Those got me through pharmacy school.
Oh yeah, I've seen such beautiful mock-ups in the books. But so the concept is similar in that you would basically have like 5 or 6 different cartridges, and one would be high in THCV, another would be high in CPG, another CBD, and then another set of like little cartridges of terpenes, right? And then basically the system would talk to the device and adjust the levels of each one. So it's like, oh, when you pull out of it, it's taking 20% from this cartridge, 5% from this one, 5% for that. So when you do something like that, your the combinatorials of that explode, right? So then you can get even closer to being like, oh, okay, like this is Nicco's energized blend, right? And then it's like, oh, now let's set it to Danielle's social blend, right? So something like that is in the works. Obviously,
this
it's
sounds
very
amazing.
complicated.
You've totally
slick.
sold me already.
I mean,
sign me
talk
up.
about
This is awesome.
That is personalized medicine. That is the epitome of, like taking your personal genetics and getting a medication that is right for you. That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's the pie in the sky for sure, is getting that completed, which is a difficult process, but
Sure.
It'll happen eventually.
That's awesome. I definitely see the need and the desire for that. I think that would be incredible because I'm assuming it would have like an app or some type of thing. So you literally could just dial in exactly what you're looking to accomplish and get it done.
Yeah, it's pretty slick, like the mock-ups we have for it now and it integrates. So it's like you can create the blend and then share that with other people and report on what effects you had and what side effects there were and what symptoms were ameliorated. And then it kind of works into our whole data system to say, okay, this is working for these people. You're very similar to those people. So here, download their blend real quick.
Now, would the cannabinoids be plant derived or synthetic?
Yeah, plant derived, ideally.
Plant derived?
Yeah.
Awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very
Super
cool.
Yeah, I want that. I'm making it for myself.
No kidding.
I think that's where
you'll be the first pilot person to try it.
I think that's where all of our great inventions come from, is somebody had the need and the desire to do this for themselves, and they thought other people would want to and be able to do it or want to do it. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, well said.
Well, Nicco, I thank you so much for coming on, and I appreciate you sharing your experience and knowledge with us. I know I learned a lot. I have looked at my report so many times, it's not funny, just because every time I look, I like get amazed by something else. I'm like, oh my God, how do you even measure that? So cool. I am very happy that we've been able to kind of shine light on Strain Genie and give more attention to it, because I think more people around this area could greatly benefit from knowing this information about themselves. How can people get in touch with you, or where can they find Strain Genie in order to?
Go to straingenie.com. There's a contact form on there that goes to me. So if you want to reach out, you can reach out to me directly. It's also Nicco, Nicco @straingenie.com. We're on all the major social medias and stuff too, if you search. So
excellent. I will be sure to link to everywhere. And if you do come across that study that you mentioned early on, if you have that handy, I would love to link that.
Yeah, for sure.
I also so this is an idea that I had before I let you go. This is an idea I had a long time ago. I tried to talk my neurologist into it, and he like shot me down because of the regulations around anything cannabis research related. I know you're a neuroscientist, so in your studies, have you ever done any type of imaging of the brain of individuals, either before, like doing a comparison before they medicate and after they medicate, or kind of like what it does for the brain?
I've not personally done that. It's quite difficult to administer in a traditional research setting, but that'd be something that's really interesting. There have been, a couple studies on even during, right? I think it was Harvard that had this like cool like oxygen tank type pump system where you're inhaling as you're in the scanner. And it's very cool. I mean, there tends to be like just a cross cortex wide cortical enhancement. Like that's kind of why the high kind of feels, so in so many different aspects and levels, and it's almost hard to describe because it's all encompassing. And a lot of the research kind of shows that as well, this more global change in activity. But now that legalization has allowed for more intense studies, I expect for a lot to come out like that. I don't right now plan to run any neuroimaging based studies on it, but it's super exciting, and I'll definitely keep in mind to shoot you a couple articles on it.
Yeah, if you ever come across them, send them my way. I just think that would be very fascinating to have that visual thing to look at.
Absolutely. I think I'll try and find that Harvard one for you.
Okay. That would be awesome. Yeah. I appreciate that. All right.
Thanks so much for listening to this Canna Conversation. To learn more, please follow us on Instagram @Midwest_Canna Concierge. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen, so other Canna curious folk can find us. We really appreciate your support.